Believing the wrong things about learning Chinese can waste time and lead you astray. Let's explore 8 more myths that might be holding you back. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to explore myths about learning Chinese. We already discussed 8 myths about learning Chinese in episode 253, and so in this episode we are going to continue with another 8 myths. You don't have to listen to part 1 before you listen to part 2, the myths are completely independent of each other, but if you want a general discussion about myths and why it can be harmful to believe in them, I refer you to that previous episode, episode 253. Today we're adding another 8 myths, and I'll go through them all before we talk about them in detail one by one. As usual, if you want to read a written version, you can head over to the article on Hacking Chinese, which also has a clickable table of contents. So the 8 myths that I will be covering in this episode are: Number 9. Learning about the language teaches you the language itself. And here there is also a mirror myth. Input is all you need. Number 10. Chinese has no grammar. Number 11. The third tone is a dipping tone. Number 12. You need 250, 2500, or perhaps 25,000 characters to understand written Chinese. Number 13. Chinese characters are pictures. Number 14. There are no shortcuts to learning Chinese. Number 15. Learning more words is always good. And finally, number 16. Learning Chongyu will make your Chinese awesome. Okay, so let's dig in, and we're starting with myth number 9, because we covered myths 1 through 8 in the previous episode. And myth number 9 is: learning about the language teaches you the language itself. Just like in the previous episode, I will also quote what people might say relating to this myth and various misconceptions that people might have. Memorizing a grammar rule will enable you to use it fluently. Being able to explain the difference between similar words is essential. Learning about Mandarin sounds is enough to learn to use them. This myth is a very commonly held belief both among students and teachers. We actually discussed this in more detail in a recent episode, 264, when we talked about comprehensible input, and it rests on the assumption that explicit knowledge, so things you learn about Chinese that you can explain in English, for example, automatically transfers to implicit knowledge, i.e. things you can do without thinking about them. And this is the kind of knowledge you actually need when you, say, speak and listen to Chinese. It doesn't help to be able to explain the difference between two words. You need to know that difference when you are actually engaging with the language. And people seem to then assume that knowing about these things also enable you to actually do these things in practice when you engage with the language through listening, speaking, reading, or writing. If we assume that learning a language is like learning other subjects in school, this is not very strange. So for example, if you understand more of the mathematics, you are also probably better at solving equations and using that mathematics compared to if you don't understand it. In mathematics, you're also tested often on explicit knowledge, so if you can't verbally explain what you're doing, it doesn't necessarily count. However, it's not a given that language learning is such an activity, and it might be more akin to, say, driving a car, where understanding how the engine works doesn't necessarily make you a better driver. In second language acquisition research, this is called the interface problem, so how these two types of knowledge interact with each other. We can identify 3 different stances or positions when it comes to this issue then, and the first one is that learning a language is like learning any other complex skill. So this is what most language students and language teachers think. So for example, you believe that if you study this grammar rule, it will then help you to apply that rule when you are speaking. And if you want to read more, you can look up Robert de Keyser, who is one of the more well-known representatives in this category. The second stance is that there is a limited or indirect link between implicit and explicit knowledge. This represents the mainstream in SLA research, and you might want to look up researchers like Rod Ellis and Michael Long if you want to read more. Exactly how much effect explicit learning has on implicit ability depends on what we're talking about. Is it grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, or something else? And also different researchers vary a bit in how much importance they ascribe to explicit knowledge. A common idea here is that explicit learning is not useful because you can turn it into implicit knowledge immediately, directly, but rather because it helps you pay attention to things you later listen to and read, and that way you can internalize the knowledge and then eventually learn it and use it on your own. The third stance is that explicit knowledge has no effect on implicit knowledge. Taken to an extreme, this means that studying grammar has zero impact on your ability to use Chinese grammar, beyond the fact that when you study grammar, you of course read and listen to Chinese, and that input can have an effect, but the explicit study of grammar has no impact. The most well-known proponent in this category is Stephen Krashen, and I talked a lot more about this in the episode about comprehensible input that I mentioned earlier, and I will as usual put links in the show notes. The myth here is that learning things about the Chinese language in English will actually make your Chinese better, and this is just wrong in most cases. Still, we have many courses in Chinese across the world where the teacher speaks mostly in English, explaining Chinese characters, Chinese grammar, Chinese pronunciation, and so on, and the students don't really engage that much with Chinese directly. This is of course not only an issue when studying Chinese, so if you took Spanish in high school and your teacher mostly talked about Spanish, how the grammar works, how to inflect verbs and so on, you probably didn't learn any Spanish, or at least not any Spanish that you could use in real-life situations. If you compare this with a teacher who speaks the target language almost all the time, and who maybe didn't need to explain that much, you will probably have learned a lot and you can use the language in real-life situations. Still, I don't think that comprehensible input is all you need, so there is also a mirror myth here, I think. Input is all you need. To be honest, I think the stance that input is all you need is a little bit weird. It clashes so obviously with lots of everyday experience, both my own and that documented by other learners. This is related to the fact that we're talking about learning a foreign language as an adult, and there are some things that just don't work with input only. It's sometimes also the case that something might work, but just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should or that it is the best approach. So let's have a look at a few examples. First, without noticing the fact that the third tone is usually a low tone, it would have taken me much longer to fix the issue. I was only able to fix this after somebody explicitly pointed it out, whereupon I noticed it in the input and then with a lot of practice managed to fix the issue. And this is one of the myths we'll talk about later, so I won't say more about it now. Second, without people pointing out that you're using a word incorrectly, it can take a very long time to pick up on it. Direct feedback about how to not use the language can be very valuable, because if you only read and listen to what native speakers say and write, you will only see examples of how things can be said and written, not how they can not be said and written. And that is something that you do need as a learner. Third, in order to communicate in Chinese, you need to develop communicative strategies, and I'm talking about things like repairing things that were misunderstood, asking someone to slow down, and otherwise just negotiating a conversation. And you don't learn this, or at least you don't automate it enough to be useful simply by listening. You need to engage in conversations yourself. Finally, number 4, speaking and writing help you identify strengths and weaknesses. It's very hard to know what you don't know how to say and write if you never speak or write. When you do so, you will constantly run across things you don't know how to say and things that you want to learn. And this can be both motivating in the sense that it impels you to learn more, but also that you have a clear goal with your learning. You want to be able to deal with this type of situation you are currently unable to deal with. So to me, it's clear that speaking and writing both have skill components that you need to practice to develop. I still believe that comprehensible input is the most important thing and that you should then add this type of explicit practice for specific things occasionally. It should not be the main thing you're doing, but I do think it can be enormously helpful if you do it correctly. As mentioned, there is an episode only about comprehensible input, and I'll link to it in the show notes. Let's move on to myth number 10. Chinese has no grammar. Chinese is just a bunch of words strung together. Mastering Chinese grammar is trivial compared to other languages. Chinese grammar is about memorizing phrases. This myth is widespread, but not terribly hard to explain, I think. It's a misunderstanding of what the word grammar means, based on studying other languages such as Spanish, French, or German. When we study these in school, we get a lot of explicit instruction of the grammar of those languages, including things like how to inflect verbs, what articles there are, if there are genders, and so on and so forth. With that in mind, it's easy to think that Chinese has no grammar, because none of these things really apply to Chinese. This is not what the word grammar actually means though. A basic definition of grammar is that it's a set of, usually implicit, rules that govern how a language is structured. And all languages have structure, otherwise you wouldn't be able to say much. And Chinese is not an exception. Without grammar, a language would just be word soup and would be impossible to understand or convey anything complex. Since the Chinese have landed spacecraft on the far side of the moon, we can assume that Chinese can be used to communicate with some precision. So what are some aspects of Chinese grammar that are important then? And many of these then are not covered in textbooks, because then everybody would know about this and it wouldn't be a myth. The first and perhaps most important one is word order, which is extremely important in Chinese because we don't inflect things like pronouns. So in English I can say I love her and her I love, and they both mean the same thing. In Chinese, however, if we reverse the word order here, 我爱他 versus 他爱我, they mean completely opposite things. We can't just check the form of the pronoun to know if it's the subject or the object. Another important and often overlooked aspect of Chinese grammar is information structure. It's often said that Chinese has the same basic word order as English, so subject, verb, object, or SVO, such as in a sentence like 我爱她, I love her. But this simplifies things a lot, and many sentences in Chinese are instead topic comment, where we put the thing we want to talk about, the topic, first, and then the information we want to convey about it second. For example, here are two sentences in Mandarin. 这个问题我不能回答 and 我不能回答这个问题. So the first is a topic comment sentence and the other is a normal SVO sentence. And both are correct, but the first one is much more common in Chinese compared to, say, English. Because in Chinese we like putting the topic or the thing the listener already knows about first and then commenting on it or providing the new information later. Next up, we also have aspect markers such as le, guo, zhe, and so on, which can be really tricky to use, and it takes a long time to understand how they work as a second language learner. These are not just randomly sprinkled into sentences, but they actually have functions and usages that you need to learn through lots of listening and reading. Naturally, these are just some examples. I just wanted to show that Chinese actually has grammar, and while it might seem simple in the beginning, you can just pile words onto each other and people seem to understand what you mean, being able to speak Chinese naturally at an advanced level is not easy. There are many grammatical things you need to master, even if there are no inflections, no gender, no articles, etc. Moving on to myth number 11. The third tone is a dipping tone. Third tones typically go down, then up. The only tone rule I need to learn is the one about 2 third tones in a row. This is something we've covered on the podcast before, namely in episode 26, so I will be brief here. The third tone is usually taught as a dipping tone, and it is true that in isolation or when you stress it heavily, it is a dipping tone. If I were to say you in Chinese, it's ni with a dipping tone, ni. And this is true even in a sentence if I want to emphasize this word, so I'm saying that I'm giving it to ni, not to ta, then I would also have this dipping tone. Still, in most other cases, and that's a vast majority of cases, the third tone is just a low tone. So the third tone is, in front of any other tone except another third tone, just a low tone. For example, USA in Chinese is 美国. It's just a low 美. It does not go up. You do not say 美国. Similarly, if you want to say teacher, it's 老师. It's just a low or low falling tone, 老师. It's not 老师. And finally, if we want something with a fourth tone, you can say 想要, as in to want to have something. It's 想要. It's not 想要. I think the best solution to this problem is to think of the third tone as a low tone. This makes all these tone change rules much easier and you need to apply them less often. But since I've already argued the case for this in episode 26, I will not repeat it here, but we move on to the next myth instead. Myth number 12. You need 250, 2,500, or maybe 25,000 characters to understand written Chinese. Here are a few related quotes. Knowing 2,500 characters means you can understand 98% of Chinese text. Understanding 60% of written Chinese requires only 250 characters. Native speakers know 25,000 characters. If you browse the online world of learning Chinese, you will stumble upon graphs that show how much Chinese you can understand with a certain number of characters. The lowest number, 250, is usually used to encourage students, saying things like, while there are thousands of characters, you actually only need 250 and then you can understand 60% of Chinese text. Sounds very encouraging, right? The fundamental issue here that underlies all these claims about how many characters you need is that reading comprehension is ultimately not about how many Chinese characters you know. Meaning in modern Chinese is conveyed through words, and a vast majority of words have more than one character. Most words are compounds, and sometimes you can guess them, or at least they make sense when you look at the components. So for example, 电话 means telephone, and it's electricity plus words. And while you might not be able to guess that out of context, at least it makes sense when you see it. Similarly, 飞机 means airplane, and it's flying plus machine, which is not hard to understand that it means airplane. However, just because you can guess them when I present them to you like that, doesn't mean that you will understand them in context the first time you see them. There are also many compounds that don't make sense and that you just need to learn. So for example, 明天 means tomorrow, so that's bright plus day, but somebody presented with these two components wouldn't be able to guess that it means tomorrow, you just need to learn that. Another common example is 东西, which means things or stuff, and that consists of east plus west. And clearly you can't know that by just looking at the components. So reading comprehension is not just about knowing characters, it's also about words. But then we also have grammar, we have other things such as interpreting the role of a specific word in context and so on. So saying that you can understand a certain percentage of Chinese text by knowing X characters is just misleading. Sometimes missing one word means you have no clue what this sentence is about, and sometimes not knowing several words in the sentence actually doesn't impact your comprehension that much because you can deduce what they mean based on context. So saying that knowing 250 characters will give you 60% understanding is almost always wrong. It usually gives you 0% understanding. This is not a myth just because the number is wrong though. If you know something like 2,500 characters, which in theory should give you a decent reading comprehension, this might still not be enough, because you might just miss the key words. Saying that native speakers know 25,000 characters is also wrong, because most native speakers don't know that many. I would say that 4,000 or 5,000 for simplified Chinese makes sense, and for traditional Chinese maybe add 1,000 or 2. And now we're talking about educated native speakers. Let's continue with myth number 13. Chinese characters are pictures. It's common in products aimed at beginners of Chinese to show or display characters as pictures. This, after all, makes sense because the building blocks and the most primitive characters actually did start out as pictures, and they are called pictographs. You have probably learned characters like Huo, fire, or water, shui, or mountain, shan, and these really did start out as pictures. Since you need to learn these, either because they are important on their own or because they are important as components in other compounds, it's easy to believe that lots of Chinese characters, maybe even a majority, are pictures like this or started out as pictures. This is far from true, however. Pictographs make up a very small percentage of characters, and the vast majority are instead phonosemantic compounds, so sound-meaning compounds, where you combine one part, standing for the sound, and another part with the meaning. One of the earliest examples you encounter as a beginner is the character ma for mother, where you have woman on the left, which represents meaning, and ma, horse, on the right, which indicates sound. While it's true that nu, woman, is a pictograph, and that ma, horse, is also a pictograph, the character ma is clearly not a picture. It's also worth noting that many of the characters that are pictographs aren't used in modern Mandarin to show what they originally depicted. A good example of this is the character r, which originally depicted the sun, so a circle with a dot on it, and then later it turned into a square with a horizontal stroke in it. This character rarely means sun in modern Mandarin, however. It's more often used to mean day, such as in 生日, birthday. Something similar can be said about the character da, which means big when it's used on its own, but in compounds it almost never means big. It is instead a person, and it refers to people in some way. If these things are new to you, I strongly suggest you check out my series of articles and podcast episodes called The Building Blocks of Chinese, and I'll provide links in the show notes. Moving on to myth 14. There are no shortcuts to learn Chinese. Looking for better ways of learning means you're lazy. When asking about better ways of learning Mandarin online, students are sometimes faced with this attitude: there are no shortcuts, buckle down or get out. But is this really true? Are there no shortcuts? I think it depends on what you mean by shortcut. If you mean if there's a secret way that allows you to bypass inputting a lot of effort, well, then there are no shortcuts. But if you by shortcut mean that there are multiple paths to reaching a goal, and some of these paths are shorter than others, then there definitely are shortcuts for learning Chinese. I think there are three types of shortcuts. First, we have methods that allow you to learn faster. So for example, using spaced repetition for learning Chinese characters makes it more efficient and you will simply learn more characters per unit time. Second, we have insights that enable you to skip ahead. So for example, understanding the role of sound components in characters is just something that's going to help you learn characters immensely compared to if you just learned them by rote. Third, it can be argued that avoiding detours is a kind of shortcut. So if other people do things in one way, but this is largely a waste of time and you don't do it, it can be regarded as a kind of shortcut. A good example of this is learning what the radical is in every character you learn, which is literally useless, although some students insist on doing this. I discussed all of these types of shortcuts in a different episode and article called Are There Shortcuts for Learning Chinese? And I'll put a link in the show notes as usual. Myth 15. Learning more words is always good. Learning vocabulary is, after all, very important, and the more words you know, the easier it will be to express yourself in Mandarin. Or, as Daniel Williams put it, without grammar, very little can be conveyed, but without vocabulary, nothing can be conveyed. Because words in Chinese and English don't overlap, it's very important to know words, because you can almost never rely on guessing them based on other languages you know. This, however, doesn't mean that learning more words is always good, and it also depends on what you mean by learning a word. Let's have a look at what this means for the four skills: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. When listening, being able to quickly identify words and connect them to meaning stored in long-term memory is essential. So it's not just about knowing many words, it's also about how quickly you know them, and not knowing them quickly enough can sometimes be more of a problem than not knowing enough words. When speaking, how well you know what you know, i.e. how fluent you are, can be much more important than knowing many words. You can say almost anything in a language using the most common 1000 words, and I once wrote an article on hacking Chinese using only the 1000 most common words in English, and most people didn't even notice. If I can write articles about language acquisition using only 1000 words, it means you can do a lot with that limited vocabulary. You do not need 10,000 words to do this. This clearly applies to writing as well, or perhaps even more so, because if there is a key word you don't know, you can just look it up. Finally, reading is perhaps the area where you really do need to know lots of words to understand, and especially if you're reading authentic texts not written for language learners. The myth here is not really that knowing a lot of words is bad, that's clearly not true, but if you spend all your time learning a lot of words, maybe you're not learning the words very well, you're just focusing on quantity rather than quality, and in many cases, especially when speaking and writing, quality matters more. The belief that more words is always better is also common when it comes to tutoring. Many teachers seem to have the motto, the more words I can teach the student, the better I am as a teacher, whereas I think that the opposite is often true. The more you can rely on what the student already knows, the better. This was actually the topic of last week's episode, so check out episode 267 if you haven't already. This brings us to the final myth, myth 16. Learning Chongyu will make your Chinese awesome. This is something I've heard often since I started learning Chinese. Add some Chongyu to your language and people will think your Chinese is great. It's a key to Chinese culture and it makes your Chinese sound very advanced, and so on. I think this is mostly nonsense. You can speak Chinese at a very advanced level without hardly using any Chongyu. This doesn't mean that accurate usage of Chongyu won't make your Chinese sound awesome, it certainly will. The problem is that the likelihood that you will use these Chongyu correctly is rather low unless your Chinese is already very advanced. Beyond the fact that Chongyu are hard to use accurately, there is an additional problem, namely that many Chongyu are not that common. You might encounter an interesting story about the Chongyu and you think it's fascinating and shows the essence of Chinese culture and so on, but the likelihood is that the expression you just studied is much less useful than almost anything else you could have learned in the meantime. Feel free to study Chongyu stories, but do so mostly because they provide excellent reading practice or maybe listening practice, not because these Chongyu themselves will be magic keys to anything. If you want a list of Chongyu that are actually very high frequency, you can check that link in the show notes. And since I've discussed the issue with Chongyu in a separate article and episode, I will include a link to that as well. With that, it's time to wrap up this episode, and we've covered 16 myths about learning Chinese that are holding you back. Maybe there are more myths, I might return to this series later, but I think this covers most of the myths that I hear and see often. If you've encountered a myth I haven't covered, or perhaps you don't agree with what I've said about one of these myths, feel free to head over to Hacking Chinese and leave a comment. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.